welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Dr. Sean Woodley, and he is the founder of Teach, Hustle, Inspire. He is a best-selling author, he's a speaker, and he is a classroom management expert, and I cannot wait to hear his stories and advice. But before we get to that, I would love to ask you, Dr. Woodley, what was your first few years of teaching like? How many years were you in the classroom? And kind of what got you interested in becoming a teacher?
Got it. So first of all, before I say anything, I wanted to just express my appreciation for allowing me to have this conversation with you. It's very, very important, and there's too much at stake not to have these conversations with people who basically determine the future of our generation and future generations. So thank you and salute to you for that. But let me work backwards. So the way that I got into the classroom was kind of not your traditional. I did not grow up wanting to be a teacher. I was not one of those people who used to play with toys and I'm going to be the teacher and you're just, that was not me. I was always the type of person who was very creative. I was very much into music and sports, and anything where I could create, where I could influence something, that's where I thrived. And so my trajectory through high school and kind of around that time to make decisions professionally, I told my teachers, because I was big into music there, I was in all sorts of different music programs. And so I was on a kind of a creativity track. And I told one of my music teachers at the time that I played the drums. And I said that I'm going on tour. Like, this is the 90s. So, I'm going on tour with Usher and Busta Rhymes. Like that was my vision. I'm going to play drums on tour professionally. And I got some really sound advice that I was talented, yes, but just in case it doesn't go the way you think it does, give yourself some options. So I said, all right, what should I do? Instead of studying just music, why don't you study music and education? I said, all right, how bad could it be? Best decision I made. So I go to school, I'm studying music, I'm studying education. I went to an HBCU, Hampton University in Virginia. Growing up in New York, I knew nothing about HBCUs. I knew nothing, but my dad actually put me onto the school because they have an annual ministers and musicians conference, and he was very familiar with some of the programs there. So I sent the application in, got accepted, and the rest is history. So I go there and start to find out that I'm not as talented as I thought I was, because where I grew up, yes, I had established a little bit of cachet as a musician, but when you come to college and find out that everybody is basically that like person wherever they're coming from, but then there's levels to this. And I was like, okay, like I'll give you context. One of my good friends, like literally right now is on tour with Charlie Wilson. Like that's how much of a talent level there was. And so I said, all right, maybe this musician thing is not going to really work out. So let me focus on education. Got into it, started taking some of my education courses and really liked it. I started to understand and gel with a lot of the psychology, a lot of the behavioral, and even the conceptual side of what it means to teach and to unlock intellectual treasure. And so just going into it that way, started to do my observation hours, student teaching, and all of those things. And it was a really good experience for me. And then fast forward, getting into the classroom, my start was odd. And I use that word with intent because I ended up teaching about 15 years. I taught at the K-12 level and I taught at the university level. So getting into the classroom was a unique experience for me because I ended up teaching not too far from where I went to college, but on the other side of the tracks. And I'm saying that kind of with the air quotes. And so I initially began my teacher search. I'm putting in, applications and things like that, and nothing is really landing. Actually, let me backtrack for just a second. I actually didn't go quite into teaching right out of college because when I did a 5-year program. And so when I'm in my 5th year coming out with a bachelor's and a master's, what ended up happening is that I'm seeing friends who kind of graduated and they're going in and getting these corporate jobs and coming back and saying, what's going on? They got these corporate cars. I want a corporate car too. So I ended up going into working for a bank actually. And I worked for a bank and hated it. And I mean, it was something that I just dreaded going to work every day. I suffered through that for a year and ended up where I was supposed to in the classroom. So I start to put in these applications and find myself not being availed to anything within a decent amount. So I expand my footprint, send some applications to schools, to districts that I'm not really familiar with, but it's on the other side of the tracks, like I mentioned before. I get invited in for an interview. Great. I go on for the interview, and it was an interesting situation because there are a couple of variables to this. Number one, I got invited to the interview in October. Now, this is unusual because for most of us, we get hired in the spring, maybe even summer, to start in the fall. I'm getting interviewed in the fall. So there was an available position where somebody was there and left. Number two, when I got taken on that tour, they took me on a tour to kind of see where my potential classroom would be, but they took me during a part of the day when those students in that hall were like on the other side at lunch. So there was nobody there. So I picked all these things and kind of parsed them and put them together. On top of the fact that when I was offered the position, like I went in there just to show them I'm supposed to be here. So I did like really, really well in the interview. I prepared and practiced, got offered the position. I'm calling people like, hey, guess what? Got this interview. I'm stepping into my calling like I'm going to be a teacher, and I would tell them what school, and they're like, yeah, just, kind of make sure you lock your doors. You're teaching at that school with those kids. Like that's the narrative that I was being fed, and I listened to it. I'm at this time 22 years old, stepping into the classroom, and I only know what I'm being told, and I'm listening to that. And this school at which I was going to teach, I'm driving past liquor stores, plasma centers, like you know what time it is. And so I get in there and I have a very clear objective in my mind. And that objective is to go in that classroom because, again, this is in October. So they just ran that teacher out of there in my mind. I need this money. I'm not going nowhere. And so my objective and goal was to show them kids that I'm not the one. Like that was my goal. And I went in there and did just that. And hindsight being 2020 now and understanding what it is that I know about what it means to be a good educator, that was not the right approach, but I didn't know any better because I was teaching, quote unquote, those kids. And I was reinforced because I was told I had good classroom management from some of my peers, because when the administrators would walk by or walk into my room, you didn't hear nothing. Like those kids was quiet. And I thought that that was a good thing until I got a phone call one day after school. I'm teaching middle school at the time, mind you. And so one of my sixth graders, her parent calls me and she says, my daughter's scared in your classroom. Now, if you could imagine like the perfect student, like I had some that were a handful, make no mistake about that. But if you could picture the perfect student who would come in and do what they were supposed to do, engage, and like this was that child, but she's scared in my classroom. And so that was a really transformational wake up moment for me where I started to understand that quiet and compliant does not equal learning. And the data showed that as well. And I had to make some really tough choices about who it was that I was going to be as a person and as an educator, and what I wanted to be, the type of teacher that I wanted to be for a lot of students who looked like me. And so I started to make some changes and really turn some things around within a relatively short amount of time.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I'm just kind of curious, what
Mhm.
would you say was your biggest struggle as a teacher, whether it be in the early years or throughout your career? What was something that was really hard for you?
It was really hard to understand balance because I did not have a good grasp on where the balance was between firm and warm. Like I'm a parent, this was almost 20 years ago. So like as a parent now, I have children, I have two kids, and I have to balance, and I understand that. I think being a teacher really helped me to be a better parent. But now I understand that there's a time and a place for everything. At that time, early in my teaching career, it was just, like, I'm not the one, go sit down, like, I was that person because I thought that's who I was supposed to be, and I did not understand the balance that was needed there. I'm working with, like, what I try to tell educators is that we work with human beings. Like, if we taught machines, we worked in a factory, you could be one way all the time and it doesn't matter. But we work with the nuance and the unpredictability and the neediness of human beings. And when you complicate that with 30 others that are in the classroom with you that have had their own experiences, and likely because of where I was teaching, experiences that were not good before they got to me, they're coming in there with a predetermined understanding of what it is that they're going to get, and they're responding to the only information that they have. And so navigating that added a level of complexity to it for me. And so it was just difficult to understand where I needed to draw that line of balance. And one of the biggest revelations that I had is that line for balance changes. Like, it is not just something where, oh, this is that definitive line. No, this could be the line one day, but maybe the next day it's over here. Maybe the next day it's a little bit over here. And being able to read and adjust to that in real time, I eventually learned was a bit more of a skill that you start to develop, and think of myself as not just responding to the students, but more so creating the conditions for them to respond to me, but understanding that there's a balance that has to take in between that. And, there's a lot of complexities and things of that nature, but of course, you have your fights and you have your altercations and things of that nature. We can get into that if you really want to. But for me, as far as what I had direct control and influence over in my classroom, is understanding that balance, and then that balance can change on a day-to-day basis. And how do I adjust without overwhelming myself?
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And I'm kind of curious, what kind of behaviors did you see? What were some of the worst behaviors, some of the most
Mhm.
extreme situations that you had? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Sure, sure. I mean, I had everything from your cursing and even physical, like a student smacked me in my face one time. I was doing lunch duty, and first of all, I hated lunch. I don't know anybody that likes lunch duty. I do not like lunch duty, but I did it. It was part of my responsibility. I'm here so I won't get fined. Great. I'm doing the lunch duty, and there was this was so I started teaching at the middle school level, but I went down to elementary later, and this was a first grader. And I forget what was the impetus for this specific, me having to redirect this student, but he wasn't where he was supposed to be. And it was just a normal, hey, come on, we're supposed to be over here. Come on, let's go. And he turned around, and I mean, it was lightning fast, whap, just across the chin. And it was more so, it didn't hurt, but it was shocking because I was not expecting it, and it completely threw me off. And I looked up, and there was another teacher who was just like, the shock on her face was like, did I just see? Like, yes, you did. And I didn't trip, because it was more so, number one, I'm not getting fired for no 6-year-old. Number two, I there's a way, again, this is well into my teaching career. It's not the first time something like that had happened. And so the other teacher took that student, wrote it up or whatever, what have you. But that was kind of one of those things where, even being well into my teaching career, it's like I'm not absolved from any of these types of instances. At that point, this is year like 9 or something like that for me. And so that doesn't make you oblivious or excuse any of those things. Like, it's just not just a new teacher thing. This is seasoned, new, old, indifferent. It does not matter.
Definitely. And I'm curious, did you, besides that situation, ever
Mhm.
feel like you were at risk for violence or anything like that?
No, because I think the implication behind that is like, did I feel unsafe? No, I did not feel unsafe. However, I did understand that at any time something could pop up. Absolutely. Yes. And things did happen regularly. Um, but did I feel walking into that building at any time that I'm going to be harmed, or no, I did not. However, with that, there was an acute awareness of, just, there was a lot of traumatic experiences that have been experienced by those students. And with those conditions, you have to understand that people are going to respond a certain way with certain triggers. And so I didn't have the language for it at that time, but I knew what to be aware of. Things didn't go from 0 to 100. There was always an escalation pattern. And so if I saw two students disagreeing about something, there's some sort of escalation that is going to happen. And as long as I can de-escalate it within a certain amount of time, I can prevent those things. Did anybody ever come at me some type of way because of something that I did that they didn't like? Of course. But I knew, again, understanding that line of balance, I got really good at being understanding of what that student might need at that moment, and trying my best not to take it personal. Understanding that what they're saying is delivered towards me, but it's not because of me. And so that allowed me to kind of just stay in a mindset where I could respond and really try to do my absolute best. I was not successful every time, but trying to give that student what they need to keep things from escalating. Did I have students use foul language with me? Of course. Did I have students who still were disrespectful? Definitely. But I tried to do what I could to control that in those moments, to keep things from just going from bad to worse.
That makes sense. And I'm kind of curious, there's sort of a debate in education and in the larger world
Hmm.
about whether or not the student's behavior is getting worse. I could just give you my own experiences in school. To give my age away a little bit, I graduated from high school in 2005. So most of
Hmm.
my own school experiences were in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I never remember students cussing out teachers, students
Hmm.
throwing desks, students being just like outward defiant and looking a teacher in the face and saying, no, I'm not going to do this. And it's
Yes.
not like I was in rich areas. I went to a few Title I schools, So it's one of those things that it seems like a lot of us have noticed a sharp increase in just
Hmm.
students' defiance, the combativeness, the attitude. I'm curious, do you feel like kids have changed, or did you see some of the kind of more defiant behaviors when you were going to school as a kid?
Sure. All the above. And let me explain what I mean by that. A lot of those behaviors that you see were there, but they were in pockets. There were certain environments where, depending on the leadership, depending on the culture of the school, depending on the culture of the district, you saw those things more regularly occur. What is starting to happen is we're seeing it with more frequency now in these modern, if you will, times, and there are several variables to this. What the research shows, excuse me, is that there are a couple of things that you can you can't say it's the cause, but you can't say it's directly the cause, but you can infer that it has at least something to do with it. Example, a lot of people understand that technology has an influence on students today. And there are a lot of reasons why. We're talking about our generation, whether you call yourself a millennial or not, or somewhere around there. We didn't grow up with technology, but we adapted to it. And we have, whether we realize it or not, adapted some of those same qualities in students that we see now that we do not desire, but we still have them. And I'll explain that in a second. But when we're talking about really digital natives, there are several systemic factors that can be attributed to this. So, for example, technology used to be a thing where there was a barrier to technology because of how much it cost. And if you didn't make a certain amount, you didn't have a certain level of income, you just did not have access to it. Now, with mass production of it and the level of availability, it's more accessible to more people. And what has happened now is it has shifted because now everyone has access for the most part. And I'm speaking in generalities here, but you have a lot more people that have access to technology. And so that barrier for technology is not there. And what happens is technology has almost replaced in a lot of communities where you have either one or two working parents, especially working odd hours. You have a lot of instances where technology is watching the kids. It's keeping them busy because mom has to do this, dad has to do this, grandma, aunt, uncle have to do, and rightfully so. We have to, and they're tired after coming home. And so I know if I can keep my kids busy for a couple of hours while I make dinner or while I get ready for work, I can give them this device and it will capture their attention. And in that moment, it helps. But what we don't realize is the long-term implications of that. Because coming from a different generation where we were outside, and I say that like in the sense of literally and in the sense of jest, like we was outside, and that taught us specific things that you had to learn in order to be able to adapt to that environment. You learned things socially, you learned about how to respond and what ways to respond. If I say this is the response I'm going to get, and that transferred and translated into the learning environment. When you have students that do not go outside as much, and there's data to back this up, they're doing something, and more often than not that time is being occupied with some sort of technological device where they don't get the same level of social exposure. And what happens is you end up with a generation of students that basically do not have the same tolerance for frustration that we have. Because when we were in school, a lot of the instruction today is the same exact way it was at that early 2000, late 90s period. A lot of it has not changed. We just add smart boards to it. But fundamentally speaking, it is passive and it is very much the same. We dealt with it because we were used to that. These students, they're not used to sitting in something that doesn't excite and entertain them. And so when that happens, when that lesson plan does not account for specific things that the brain is looking for cognitively to engage with, boredom sets in. And then what happens is you introduce that one idea of boredom can go so many different ways depending on the students and how they respond to it. And then that's what introduces us to a lot of the behavior problems that we see, the lack of students who don't seem motivated and who don't engage. All of these things stem from, in some ways, that them not being adjusted to not having technology. Another form that can be a contributing factor to this, and I think this is with the best of intentions, but parenting has changed a lot too. And let me first say, before I say this is no slight to any parents, because I do and wholeheartedly believe that every single parent wants the best for their child. However, there are different approaches to parenting than there were a generation or so ago. I was of the, without trying to really go there too much, but when we talked about discipline, there were nearby objects that were used to help discipline.
Yeah.
And I'm just telling you like it is.
Mhm.
And that it worked. Now, with research and things, you want to kind of try to take some different approaches. You want a more humane approach to discipline. And I'm saying that with the air quotes as well. And so this idea of this gentle parenting has made its way into the equation again with the best of intentions. But I think what has happened, and I don't have the data, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but what you're seeing is, in combination with students who do not have the tolerance to deal with frustration, you also don't have the same level of students who are used to dealing with authority and or being held to a certain behavioral expectation, because that gentle parenting kind of skewed into permissive parenting. And it is a situation where the students do not have the same level of accountability from a parenting perspective and respect for authority. They were not really taught that in a lot of instances. This is not universal. This is not every single child, but we're seeing more of it. And then when you combine that with going into the classroom with more frequency of students who, again, do not have that same level of tolerance, and this passive instruction that we're taught to do in the classroom, it almost creates a formula for disaster every single time.
Definitely. And I guess as I'm thinking of this and reflecting upon my own 8 or so years in the classroom, I
Mhm.
got to a point where I felt like there was literally nothing I could do, because almost all of the schools that I taught at, even going all the way back to 2013, they either had, Chromebooks or they had iPads. They had technology. We probably spent, tens of thousands of dollars as a district getting all of these really fun, colorful apps they were gamified, they were
Mhm.
differentiated to their different levels. We used all kinds of different things like vocabulary and brain pop, so lots of media. We did
Mhm.
tons of collaborative activities like turn and talk, think, pair, share. So I feel like on paper, I was doing everything short of juggling flaming bowling pins to be
Yes.
entertaining and
Mhm.
interactive and moving around the room like a ninja and having people turn and talk and having them listen to, educational music and videos and all the things. And it got to the point where none of that seemed to matter. They were kind of bored and disengaged with that too. And so it really got to a point where I was thinking, especially when I ended up quitting in 2021, the pandemic year, I was like, there's nothing that I can do because nothing that I'm doing is working. And my theory, which I know is a slightly controversial one, but my
Mhm.
theory is we have tried as an education system to change and adapt to these new students by removing consequences, by removing grades, by removing the ability to fail, by taking away rewards like, recess, field trips, parties. A lot of times students can't even be really removed from the classroom,
Mhm.
even when they are a huge distraction and even a danger to the classroom.
Mhm.
So what has happened, I think proverbially, there's the saying, you need the carrot and the stick. I feel like all we have are carrots. We're trying desperately to reward, engage, entertain, and all of these things, but without any consequences. A huge swath of kids just are not motivated because they know that there's not going to be anything that happens to them that is undesirable. They know they're allowed to continue with their misbehavior. They're allowed to continue not turning in work. I know the last year that I taught, it was a hybrid year with the pandemic. We did have students in class, but we also had students online and we juggled doing both of
Sure.
those. And
Hmm.
I got to the point where upwards of 90% of my students were turning in absolutely nothing. And I'm still
Hmm.
being held accountable for their data and their test scores and being blamed. So I just think there's a massive sense of disillusionment with teachers because we feel like the message we're getting from administrators and from professional development is you need to do more, you need to be better, you need to make these kids like you need to build relationships. But we're thinking we are doing all of that and more, and the kids are laughing in our face.
Yes.
We are like desperately just like practically begging these kids to be kind, to be respectful, to do work. We have given them everything during the pandemic
Hmm.
year. We really, really tried to make accommodations for people that didn't have technology. So we literally, our district purchased internet connections for kids that were at home. We purchased
Hmm.
devices and we could see what the kids were doing on their devices. They were using the devices to play games, but they wouldn't log in for 10 to 15 minutes to do like their Moby Max assignment or their Clever assignment. So it's just, I feel like it feels like a checkmate in education right now
Hmm.
because we do have all of these issues with kids that you mentioned, the not really understanding consequences, not respecting authority, being addicted to screens, really having some very, very bad role models on social media. They're
Hmm.
bringing that chaos into the classroom, and teachers' hands are tied, and we're told, well, you can't do anything about it. Just build a relationship, just make them like you somehow. And that is just so hard. So I know that that was a lot. That was like
No,
black,
I
you
that
know, but
helps.
what do
It
you
helps
think about
tremendously.
that?
I let me first say that the story that you share is all too familiar, and that there's a couple of different ways to respond to that because when you think about it from the top down, I think a lot of times that leadership, and this is leadership at all levels, has the best of intentions, kind of like what I mentioned about parenting. The intentions are good with the information that they have. Doesn't make it right all the time. And my one of the things, just from a research perspective, that I understand very well now that I kind of started to see in the classroom but didn't have the language for, is that the way that we are prepared to be teachers versus the way that students actually think, function, and engage with the world are vastly different. We come out of teacher preparation programs, and that's even if you went to a teacher preparation programs, you have a lot of people who are career switchers, and so they're learning on the job, which puts them in an even worse situation. But we come out of these programs a lot of times with excellent content knowledge. We come out of these programs a lot of times with a plan for pedagogy, but not necessarily the nuance that is human interaction. And what I've started to understand is that managing student behavior, engaging students is a meta skill. It's not something that is linear. It is not first to do this, and then do that, and you will be successful. There is no human interaction that works step one, step two, step three, step four, but that's what we're taught. You use that phrase, just build relationships, and I hear that all the time. And what I try to help educators understand, and I walk them through sometimes with, specific examples in these workshops, is that when you're trying to build a relationship with someone, first of all, like, that's a lot easier said than done. And when you hear someone in a professional development setting say that, a lot of times what is left out of that conversation are the concrete elements that it takes to build a relationship, because it varies from person to person. You have people that have specific proclivities and nuance, and how do you account for that? There's cultural barriers. There are so many different rules, spoken and unspoken. I'll give you an example. When I'm in the classroom one time and my students are doing a group work activity, my students came in, started the day handing in last night's homework assignment. That was a win because I had everybody turn in the assignment. I was like, this is going to be a great day. It's one of those. So they're doing the group work activity, and I'm putting the grades in the computer so that I can track everything. And I get to the end of the pile and I'm missing one. And so I'm looking and I'm missing one from looking at the computer. The young lady, I said, I thought she gave it to me. So her group is in the back. So I call out, I'll just say her name is Kelly. Kelly, call out Kelly, come here real quick. She looks up, she goes, what? Like that. Now, for me, in that moment, because of like where I come from and how I was raised, that she might as well just cussed at me, because in my parents' household, one thing that you did not do was respond to an adult with what. And I had been, listening to my training and stuff like that. I'm reading it. So okay, this is a moment for me to exercise emotional intelligence because I feel myself being triggered at this moment. My instinct was for me to reach down into that second drawer on the lower left-hand side and get me those pre-written referrals because I kept a stack on me. All I had to do was fill in the name. But something just was like, all right, what if she was not raised with the same cultural understanding? Because a lot of times we think of culture as like food, music, dialect, lingo, slang, things of those nature, things of that nature. But there's an observable facet to culture, but then there's also unwritten rules that trigger emotions, and that was a violation of some unwritten rules. And the thing is, a lot of times with this connects directly to relationships, is because we expect other people to know those unwritten rules without telling them, because that may be an unspoken rule in my community, and that was actually very spoken. But what about her community? Her intent was not to be disrespectful, but my body told me that I was being disrespected. And so that moment where I'm actively working on any other day to build a connection and solid human connection with my students, that was a very easy opportunity for me to ruin all of that hard work, because I would have responded in a way and would have totally blindsided that student, because in her mind, what did I do wrong? I just really wanted to know what. So when we talk about this idea of building relationships, there's a lot more to it than just, again, step one, step two, step three, and understanding the nuance and what it takes to really digest something as a meta skill, and understanding that it is very situational and there are sub skills that you have to learn to be able to be well versed in relationship building. It is the same principles that, whether it is a friendship that you are building with someone, whether it is a professional relationship, whether it is a student to teacher authoritative relationship, a parent to child, there's nuance to all of that. And there are sub skills that you have to learn first, and for a certain level of automaticity to take place where those things are automatic, but you got to learn the sub skills first. And that is what it takes to take all of those things and build it. And then you pick and choose which ones you need in specific moments, and you get better with time and practice.
That definitely makes sense. But my experience was that I would have those kind of conversations and they would proceed to continue to do what I asked them not to do over and over and over again. Because I know, like, the
Mm-hmm.
OG, classroom management books, like The First Days of School by Harry Wong, like all of those, they would tell
Mm-hmm.
you to have like morning procedures, door greetings, a way that you collect homework, even different books like Teach Like a Champion. There's all of
Mm-hmm.
these procedures that you set up. And we're understanding that for the first 3 weeks of school, kids are going to forget, they're going to misunderstand, they're going to need those reminders. But what I would find happening was that 6 months into school,
Mm-hmm.
I'm still having kids violate basic procedures. Things
Mm-hmm.
like, maybe if I'm standing at the door and they know the expectation is everybody, greets me, we shake hands, have a great day, come on in. But then I have kids that refuse to greet me or refuse to look at me and just walk by.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Silly things like that. Or, they know that the procedure is, this is how you're supposed to take out homework, or simple things like they know that they're not supposed to be talking during lessons. And
Right.
I would talk to admin, and their big thing was always that if kids are misbehaving, it's because they don't understand the procedure, or they misunderstood somehow what you were asking. And I was like, no, we've been through this. We've written class essays about this. We've had verbal
Yes.
conversations about this. They know the expectation. They know that they are being disrespectful and they are intentionally doing it. And there's nothing
Uh-huh.
I can do. What about that?
Okay, so here's my question to you in that moment, because you bring up a very good point. My question would be this: how did you, in those moments, establish authority? Or not even in those moments, like what was your stance on, or what was your approach to establishing authority in the learning environment?
Yeah, so for me, I'm actually a very nice, gentle person by nature. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would do a lot of talking, a lot of discussing, a lot of explaining. We did all the community meetings, we did the circles, we did the reflection sheets, we talked about classroom culture, we talked about our values as a classroom. I feel like I talked till I was blue in the face.
Okay.
And I was not like mean or nasty or like ugly to them in any way. It was just like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, remember the expectation. This is what we do as a class. And it just felt like none of that worked. They thought it was a joke. And for me, in my mind, it comes back to, there's no consequences, because I'm
Okay.
all for being relational, being kind, building rapport. getting to know fun facts about your students and being able to bring that up, knowing what is, popular or whatever in songs and things, and like, incorporate that into the math question of the day. Like, I'm
Hmm.
totally fine with all of those things. But to me, it goes back to like kind of like carrot and stick a little bit. It's
Okay.
like you can do that all day, but if nothing ever happens for direct defiance and disrespect, for direct refusal to do what they're asked, then to me, for a kid, that's too much temptation. It's
Yeah.
just like for us at work, I'm
Hmm.
sure all of us have had jobs where we know the one boss, they're not going to enforce any standards. They're not enforcing dress code. They're not looking at the clock to see how long that you're on break. And so that person is just going to get taken advantage of because it's just human nature to want to
Hmm.
do the least, to want to have fun,
Hmm.
to want to
Yeah.
have a good time. And so I think for all of us, what keeps us in line is knowing, all right, if I mess around too much, I'm going to get written up. I'm going to get fired. I'm going to have an uncomfortable, like a truly uncomfortable warning conversation with my boss that says, if this
Sure.
happens again, you're not going to work here. And so I just feel like all of that has been removed from education. And so I just feel like literally our hands are tied and all we could do is say, now, the expectations, what are we supposed to do? And they can repeat
Hmm.
that, but yet they're not doing it.
Gotcha. So there's a couple of things to that. In your learning environment or just in general, how do you know your students trust you?
How do I know my students trust me?
Hmm.
I guess that's kind of an internal state. So it's a little hard to know for sure. But generally, I think when you trust people, there's an openness.
Okay.
You can ask questions. There's a vulnerability, like students would share their poetry and their work with the class. And you can
Hmm.
really tell, I think, with kids, there's so much of the cool factor. It's like when they're willing to share something from their heart that meant a lot to them, there's
Hmm.
definitely a sense of trust there.
Okay. And I asked that question because when we talk about this idea of authority in the learning environment and consequences, my stance on this and approach has been to try as little as possible to rely on things that are outside of my immediate control or influence. So, in other words, and somebody's not going to like this, and I know, but it's all good. I'm speaking from a research perspective and the truth, even though this may not be your experience. What I would hope people take away, or one of the takeaways would be, is that you have a lot more control and influence over that learning environment than you might think. I'll give you an example. I did a workshop just yesterday and I asked this question. I said, have you ever seen an instance where a student behaves one way in one classroom and then go right next door and almost is somebody totally different? Let me ask you, have you seen that before?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. Why do you think that is?
Hmm. I think group dynamics are kind of, very variable. So maybe in one
Hmm.
class, there's certain peers and classmates that interact differently. I think some teachers, their demeanor, elicits different reactions from kids. So I think it's a lot of times personalities, both of the kid, their classmates, and the teacher.
I agree. I use this example, and this is all current politics and things of that nature aside, right? Many of us have had shopping experiences in different places. I'll use the Walmart versus Target. I was in a workshop yesterday and I asked everybody in the workshop, okay, I'm sorry, day before yesterday. I said, have you been to both stores before? Everybody raises their hand. I said, okay, which one is more expensive? Target. Everybody knows that. Objectively speaking, Target, and this is not like I think it is, this is objective. This has been replicated time after time and again. Target is objectively more expensive than Walmart for the same exact things. Yet, you will have people that drive past a Walmart and go into Target, and they will do that full well knowing that they're going to spend more money. You might tell yourself, "Oh, I'm just going to get a little, a little toothpaste and a couple of little knickknacks." But $250 later, when you come to that register, reality sets in, and it's already too late by then. And in your mind, it is okay. And the reason for that is because Target does a very, very good job of creating a specific environment where you feel good. There's a lot to it psychologically, but if I can get you to feel a certain way, I can increase the chances of you behaving a certain way. If I can get you to feel good, I can get you to spend good. Now, that's not proper English, but you get the point. I know that when I go in that learning environment, that shopping experience in that store, the lights are brighter. I'm going to be greeted with the smell of Starbucks, and I'm going to spend $18 on a 3-ounce coffee and be just fine with it, and walk around and take my time and enjoy that shopping experience and objectively spend more money, and I'm okay with that. And that does not make logical sense, because we do not work off of logic. The human brain, the way that it has evolved and has really learned to survive, what most people do not understand, but it is very relevant to what we do in the classroom and the learning environment every single day, is that 98% of the functional processes of the brain are automatic responses, and only 2% are logical. And so when you understand that people respond to instinct before logical thought even has the opportunity to process, it causes you to think differently about your learning environment. People behave differently in Target because it is designed that way. People will spend more, feel better, rightfully so, because it intentionally is a better experience. When you go to specific classrooms, you could have a group of students a group of students in room 101 raise HE double hockey sticks and go right next door to room 102, and a halo appears, because the environment is going to dictate and influence the conditions. And the more that people understand you can influence those things strategically, when you understand, psychologically speaking, what the brain is looking for, it creates an opportunity for you to restructure your engagement and your approach to students. Example, when I talk about this idea of authority is one of those ideas in the learning environment where we understand it has to be there, but there is a lot of nuance to authority. But when you get it right, when you create your position of authority in the learning environment, what people don't understand is that sometimes we have, and this goes back to the parenting conversation as well. So I'm kind of going in two different places simultaneously, but stay with me here. The thought process a lot of times is that if I ease back a little bit and make this more of a pleasurable experience and reduce some of the consequences, they'll behave and they'll do more of what I want to, because it's not such a harsh condition. Not realizing that letting the reins off actually creates uncertainty, which now elevates threat detection responses, because I don't know what's going to happen, the elevated stress levels, and so I'm responding in very volatile and sometimes unpredictable manners. When you have authority and you establish that authority in the learning environment, what that does is it helps the students. And notice, I'm not saying oppress them. I'm not saying be mean to them. I'm saying authority. It helps them to be able to relax their nervous systems, because you are in control. And when you are in control, what people don't understand is that there's a submission reflex that kicks in. It's an automatic reflex, because there's control and there's an established authority present. I can predict more likely than not what is going to happen. And because of that, not predict as in like tell the future, but predict that likely psychologically, physically, I'm going to be safe. So my threat detection systems and my nervous systems can relax. And that opens the space for more pro-social behavior. That opens the space for students to engage and not worry about protecting themselves. That opens the space now for when consequences are issued, that students are more likely to follow them. And what that does is it puts the control back into the hands of the teacher without trying to rely so much on outside forces. Parents, yes. Administrators, yes, you want their support, but you may not always have that, but you have more control over student behavior than you may realize. And again, there's variance to every single thing. Will you have your students that still pop up? Of course. But when you have that established authority in your learning environment, where you have this level of active demandingness and holding those students to that behavioral expectation, not being passive and not letting them get away with every single thing that they want to, but also balancing that with a certain level of professional warmth, you create the conditions for those students to be their best selves, and the characteristics that you desire to see out of those students are more likely to appear.
I actually agree with you 100%. I think the problem is that teachers' authority has been stripped away by a lot of these policies. So when we go back to some of my examples, if kids know that nothing is going to happen if they directly defy what they've been asked to do, if they don't ever follow through on getting their work done, like thinking back to that pandemic year, the kids, I would say authority only goes so far as the authority figure's ability to enforce something. It's kind of how people joke about like mall cops or something, because they're
Okay.
like, okay, you're wearing the uniform, but you're not going to do anything to me. And so I think that
Hmm.
that's the problem. It's like I've talked to veteran teachers that are excellent classroom management experts, but in these new systems where they literally can't give consequences, it's like if you even speak, too firmly, teachers are getting in trouble for that. If you have class dojo and you're taking away too many points, you're being told you're too negative. There's pushes within education to not even use the word no, to try to reframe it as we use inside voices instead of saying don't scream in the hallway. So I
Uh-huh.
guess my
Uh-huh.
my conundrum
Uh-huh.
is that I feel like authority, at least this is how I felt as a teacher, I can't do anything and the kids know it. And so even they even know that you can't like look at them sideways. They're just like, I'm going to tell my mama, everything. It's just like teachers have no authority. And so all we're left with basically is practically begging and pleading for kids to do the right thing, which kids obviously don't respect either. So I guess
Hmm.
the stalemate that I see is I feel like modern teachers can't do anything because we can't take away consequences. We can barely take away a point on class dojo. If a teacher is accused of being too firm, they're in trouble. I mean, I feel like we probably swung the pendulum from
Hmm.
maybe in the 40s and 50s, teachers had all of the authority and kids had no voice. But I feel like it
Hmm.
swung all the way to teachers, have no authority and kids have all of the power and the voice, and they know it. They'll threaten a teacher in a second. They'll
Yeah.
say, I'll get you fired. I'm telling my parents. I've had teachers I've had students actually say to me, I'm going to go to the principal to complain about you. And so it's an
Hmm.
unpopular word, but I feel like kids have become spoiled brats these days.
Hmm. Hmm.
Absolutely no discipline, no respect, no consequences, and they know the power that they have and that the teacher has none. And so now it's like, when people are like, well, what can I do as a teacher? I'm
Hmm.
like, I honestly don't know,
Yeah.
because it's like when all of your ability to take authority in the classroom, even in a healthy, kind way, has been stripped. I feel like the new model, like the answer we get all the time is, did you talk to them? Did they understand? Did you talk about their feelings? Did you build a relationship? And it's like we're doing all of those things till we're blue in the face and the kids think it's funny. And they
Yeah.
learn how to manipulate and game the system and say the right things to their parents and admins to make themselves look like they're a victim of some tyrannical teacher when actually the teacher is being victimized in the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what is happening in a lot of these instances is the difference between, I think of it from a leadership perspective, right? In the learning environment, we are leaders of the classroom, but there are different types of leaders. And sometimes we want that leadership and authority to come through a title. And that's not always the case. For example, I've worked with some administrators when I was a teacher, and you've had those administrators who will try to come at you because I'm the assistant principal or I'm the dean, and they'll try and talk down to you, and their authority in their mind, you can tell it comes from their title. But then you have those servant leaders who, whether it is somebody who is, you can have somebody who is a servant leader, they could even be on your quote unquote same level as an educator, or they can be the building principal, but they approach leadership differently. It's like, are you a leader or are you a manager? Because when you manage, what's happening is your authority comes from the title, and then you're using policy to reinforce and or try and elicit specific behaviors. But when your leadership comes from more of a servant leadership and you're positioning yourself as someone that those students want to follow, you get really different results. When that principal is positioning themselves as someone who teachers want to follow, you're getting very, very different results. Give you an example. A lot of times, from a human interaction standpoint, right? What I try to help educators understand in the workshops that I deliver is that all human behavior, it basically stems from a lot of the same exact things. Like we're all on a quest to meet very specific drivers of behavior. We all have a need to belong. We all have a need for autonomy. We all have a need for mastery and learning. We all have a need for safety, and we all have a need for meaning. And the reason that that is important, and I'm not talking about Maslow here, like please make no mistake about that. I'm talking about what drives our existence. Like, we would not be here if we did not fundamentally understand and feel and were driven to be a part of a social group, if we did not learn how to, like, literally learn to learn, if we did not learn to raise children, if we did not learn to read weather patterns, if we did not learn to interpret meaning making from pattern interruption. So in other words, these are all innate skills that we come out of the womb with. These are hardwired, and it drives pretty much everything that we do. And what I mean by that is, when you understand that, and then understand that those are the direct causes of a lot of the psychological processes that happen in the human mind, whether you realize it or not, and then subsequent behaviors come from those things, it shapes what you do differently. And you start to look at authority, you start to look at engagement, you start to look at everything differently. I'll give you an example about what it looks like in the learning environment. So from a leadership standpoint, from an authority standpoint, right, we have social processing systems. Example, if you are someone who is on social media, right, let's just go old school for a second. On Facebook, you post a comment, post a picture on Facebook. You're doing that, like, with very specific intentions, consciously or subconsciously. You're sharing that. First of all, it's called social media. You're doing that with the intent to engage socially. We do that because we are putting that out there and we want feedback. And then you put that phone down, and then you get that notification. Number one, that notification triggers internally that there's something, likely anticipation of a reward. And so you get that hit of dopamine. And now curiosity is also a part of the equation. You have to, like, you're driven to go see what that response is because there's an intention there. You can likely get some sort of a reward, going back to the social processing, going back for the need to belong. Like, that influences and drives a lot of the things that we do. From an authority standpoint, if I'm a leader in the learning environment and I'm positioning myself as someone who my students want to follow, if I'm a leader in that school and I'm positioning myself as someone who I want my teachers to follow me, I have to understand that there are certain things that drive behavior. There are certain psychological comforts that are needed every single day. And that when I put those comforts and needs ahead of the policies, then I have a greater chance of allowing those students to really, going back to what I mentioned before, lower their defenses. When we talk about this idea of authority and essential power in a student, like knowing that there are no consequences, what supersedes that is their desire to want to connect with that teacher. A student will want to connect with a teacher, but if they do not see a means to that, that's when other outside factors, such as the need to entertain peers and the need to entertain themselves and disrupt lessons, like that social and biological need to connect with their peers and to connect with that teacher is a priority. And if they don't see an avenue to that, that is an invitation for other things to basically stimulate. Like, how can I stimulate myself? If I know I'm not going to have the psychological and social comfort or the emotional comfort of engaging socially, then how else can I make sure that I'm safe? How else can I make sure that I can entertain myself and have some sort of stimulation? And so it leaves room for those opportunities. Like, there's a lot of nuance to it because, as I mentioned before, it is a meta skill, and it is something where there are a lot of sub skills that make up and determine what those interactions look like on a day-to-day basis, because you have different children, but they're different children and they're expressing the same needs in different ways. Like, everybody needs the same thing, they just don't need it the same way. And that's when the meta skill comes, because you see that this child, well, they need to talk a little bit more. But this child, they need to be a little more closer in proximity to you because that helps them feel safe. They're all going for the same things, they're just not approaching it the same way. And when we start to see that, we can give the kids what it is that they need. And what we realize is that counteracts their need to go to the principal and I'm telling on you, or I'm telling my mom, because there really is a lot of times, and I don't mean this the way that it's going to come off, but there's no need for any of those things if those children feel safe in that learning environment. And a lot of times what we're seeing is when we see students that are disengaged, when we see them, these maladaptive behaviors, those are indicators that something is not aligned in some way, shape, or form. It has nothing to do. I don't want to say it has nothing to do. It doesn't have as much to do with the outside factors of the policies and the leadership. Yes, that influences, but statistically speaking, that teacher is the thermostat in that learning environment, and that environment is going to dictate the behaviors that the children choose to display, consciously or unconsciously, and we have more control over that than we realize. If we're seeing those behaviors where the students are responding in ways that we do not want to, that is an indication that something is not aligned the way that it should be, and that adjustments are needed to be made.
Well, I'm going to have to lovingly disagree, Dr. Woodley. I'll tell you why, though, and I want you to challenge my thinking.
Okay, go for it.
The argument that I would make is that the bar has moved to an absolutely impossible place for teachers, because this wasn't the deal in the 90s and the early 2000s. My thought process going into the classroom wasn't like, is this teacher making me feel seen, heard, and loved? Have they connected with me? Am I safe? My mindset, and every student's mindset, was we're in school to get an education. You might not like the teacher. Some teachers are boring. Some teachers may even be a little bit weird or abrasive. Not
We all have
harmful,
that one science
weird.
teacher.
Yeah, like everybody's had the weird teacher. Like I had, I hope she doesn't see this, but I had a teacher in high school that everyone would talk about how she would clean her contacts in her coffee and then put them back in her eye. And she had like these long dagger nails. So kids roasted her behind her back. But in classroom, everybody was angelic because the whole framework and mindset was different. As students, we knew it was on us to perform. And that's the same situation even in college for me right now. I have teachers and professors with very different learning, like teaching and learning styles. And there's been some classes where for whatever reason, I feel like I'm learning nothing from the 3-hour class. And so what have I had to do? I've had to spend hours outside of the classroom teaching myself, kind of difficult content for some of the classes. And so I feel like we've moved the bar on teachers to this impossible place that isn't true in any other context in the world. When you go to a job, some bosses are going to be raggedy. Some bosses are going to be amazing leaders, but you're there to get your check because you have a mission to accomplish. And that's not at all to excuse raggedy bosses or teachers. It's just like in the world, we cannot make everybody like us. We cannot, accommodate ourselves. As a middle school teacher, I might have had 120 students. I can't individually create this emotional bond to every kid in like a 50-minute block when we've got a list of things to do. I just feel like it's an absolutely impossible hamster wheel for teachers to be on. And I think I don't mean this rude, but it feels like the ultimate sense of gaslighting a teacher, because it's like we know that we're doing probably 10 times more than the teachers that we were growing up with did in terms of differentiation, in terms of social emotional learning, in terms of checking in terms of engagement, in terms of even being aware of like kids' backgrounds. The 90s teachers weren't doing any of that. And like, it's like we're working harder and getting less results than our just old school teachers that just showed up. Here's your worksheet, examples on the board, just like, and somehow all over the world, there's kids in like China and India and Africa, that they're not having all of this pressure put on the teachers. The kids they got a fire under their feet because their parents are like, education is important. You need to learn this stuff. You're going to be doing your homework for hours at night. And so I just feel like we've set teachers up in this absolutely impossible system where everything that goes wrong is the teacher's fault. And this happened to me in an awful private school situation where I taught 7th and 8th grade. If anybody wants to hear the horror story, they can, watch my Why I Quit Private School Teaching video. But these kids banded together early in the year to just destroy me. They made up career-ending rumors about me. By the 3rd week of school, they put a petition out to get me fired. Wow. These kids were making memes about me on Instagram. And what did my administrators tell me? Well, are you making the kids feel safe? That's why that's like a trigger word for me, because it's like, I don't feel safe up in this mug. Like these kids are out for me. And it's like, I was being so nice and kind and accommodating and doing all the things. I had rules and structure, but it's just, I feel like these kids these days really are different. They are coming into the classroom and the authority figure is the enemy. I would push back on the idea that they're like trying so hard to connect with the teacher. It's like subs get like sent out of buildings in tears because it's like the teacher or the authority figure that shows up in the room is actually the target and kids band together against them. And so it's not that I don't I'm not saying that there's nothing that teachers can do. I mean, there's a really interesting kind of movement called verbal judo that talks about de-escalating situations and how they've trained police officers, for example, to de-escalate. So I'm all for de-escalation. I'm all for making connections, but I just truly believe to my bones
Mm-hmm.
that when you ask a kid to do something hard, a lot of learning is hard. It's
Mm-hmm.
reading, writing. A lot of these standardized tests are hard, SATs and ACD. It's a lot of hard, boring work. And there's only so much you can do to dress it up before the kid has to put in the work and sweat. Just
Of
like,
course.
we would for the Olympics or for being a musician or for doing anything in life. There's boring drills, there's painful, tedious, hard work, and there's just no way to fix it. So anytime in psychology, even when you're asking a kid to do something hard, they're not going to like it and they're not going to want to do it. And they have to be taught how to have grit. They have to be taught, that they sometimes need to adapt, because I think that
Mm-hmm.
the message that's being given to teachers is you have to adapt to everyone, and kids are coming in expecting like it's Burger King, have it your way. And it's impossible for a teacher to do that for everybody. And so I guess my plea is always to come back to the middle, because I know that there was like authoritarian, terrible teachers back in the day that really were cruel and abusive. Like that is a reality. But I
Yes.
feel like this like free range teaching that has no consequences, it's
Free
just
range
not
teaching. I like
working.
that.
Yeah, because it's like kids, they're
Uh-huh.
smart. They know
Oh
if
yeah.
I get assigned this kind of hard assignment, I don't have to do it. Why would they do it? I mean, it's just like in college, if you had some classes where you realize real quick, well, I don't have to do the readings because the teacher's not going to test on it. You will have some super students that love to read and they love education and they love the topic and they're going to go for it. But it's
Mm-hmm.
just in human nature, when something is hard and a little bit boring and a little bit unpleasant, we're just naturally going to have a push where it's like, oh, I don't really want to do that. And traditionally, throughout history and all of time, we just learn self-discipline. We learn that there's certain things we have to do that just aren't fun. And I just feel like with that dynamic being taken out of education, I feel like the only person left to blame is the teacher. So the
Mm-hmm.
kid, that first grader could come in and slap you, and then you could have a principal say, did you make little Bobby feel safe? It's like, no, I didn't do nothing to have him smack me in the face. It's like kids are coming in on 10. They're
Yeah.
throwing desks, they're ripping apart bulletin boards. And it's just like, I don't know. I kind of see there's a relationship between consequences being taken away and kids' behavior. You kind of
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier back in the day, there was a chancla or a sandal that was going to meet us, if we got that phone call from, the school saying that your kid was acting crazy in school today. So there was just, whether you agree with corporal punishment or not, there was a sense that reigned in our childish impulses. And I
Yes.
feel like as that's been removed, it's like kids are off the chain. And I think blaming the teacher for that by saying you need to do more is like the ultimate gaslighting. And it's clear I feel
So
strongly about it.
no, and rightfully so. And let me clarify here. Um, what I want to make very clear is what I am not doing is blaming the teacher. I don't know if it came across that way. So let me make sure that I'm clear here, because our role in the classroom is too important. Like we're all on the same side. My stance is that the way that we are prepared to be, and this is going back from teachers in the early 2000s, early 90s, or whatever, the way that we are prepared to be teachers doesn't match the student that is in the classroom. When I say, let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. You
Sure.
mentioned something very interesting, and you said it's in human nature not to, you said it's in human nature not to want to, basically to do hard things.
Mhm.
Why?
I think it's like the path of least resistance. I think
Mm-hmm.
as humans, we want comfort, we want ease, we want pleasure. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have to have some kind of motivation to overcome that inclination toward comfort and ease.
What
And so
determines
I think,
motivation?
hmm?
What determines motivation?
I think it can be internal or external. I think as children, there needs to be a lot of external motivation because kids are notorious for wanting to eat cake all day and not wanting to eat broccoli. They're notorious for not wanting to clean their room. They're notorious for not wanting to take a bath. It's like
Uh,
kids kind of show our human nature, but
yes.
like we just, even if it's something good for us, it's like, oh, I want comfort. And
Yes.
so externally, a good parent provides boundaries, structures, rules,
Hmm.
rewards, and consequences. And I think
Agree.
consequences, are kind of at the end of the list. It's like when you've exhausted everything else, we've talked about it, I've given you the rationale for why it's good for you. It's like at the end of the day, eventually it's like, okay, we're going to have a
Hmm.
consequence if you just will not do what I know as an adult is good for you to do.
And I wholeheartedly agree with you. And what I think part of the issue is getting to that same end, but how we're taught to get to that end. Let me use your example of the kids, they want to eat cake. It's an external delivery, but to satisfy an internal drive. The internal drive is for that hit of dopamine that they get, and for that satisfaction of achieving that reward, because you're talking about two different psychological processes that result in the same thing, but there's multiple things happening there. So yes, that sweetness of that cake, that candy, definitely is going to outweigh your broccoli and your lima beans, of course, but it's to satisfy something internally here. They want comfort. They get comfort when they have when they have the comfort and predictability of a social relationship, because we're the only species, or one of few species, that relies on authority and parenting a lot longer than your average and any other, living creature. It takes a lot more effort, and like a baby cannot survive, a child cannot survive, literally cannot survive without that influence of their parent. And there's a lot of nuance to that, but we rely on that, and instinctively there are certain things that we are looking for day to day. And that is why, when those needs are not met, and when I say needs, I'm not talking about just like surface level needs. I'm talking about drivers, universal drivers of behavior. When you mention that idea of like human nature is very complex, and it is very dynamic, meaning that there are a lot of things that are happening at the same time, and a lot of times they do not make sense. But when you understand what the goal is, it makes a little more sense. So someone can be in a classroom, a student can be in a classroom, and that question of, did you make them feel safe? Like, when people ask that question, I really don't think they know what they're really asking. When someone feels psychologically safe, when someone feels physically safe, it's very clear. When threat detection systems are activated, when someone feels that they have to protect themselves, it's very, very clear. And so when someone is asking you, a lot of times, and this goes back to what I mentioned before about how we are trained. When we are trained to be teachers, or even a lot of the training that we get now with the best of intentions, it doesn't get to the root of understanding what's really at play. I'll share some information like on social media, and I get pushback sometimes, and I welcome it. But they're like, "Well, we're not trying to be psychologists," and it feels like that. But any sort of human to human interaction that you can think of, whether it is a professional relationship, a personal relationship, a student to child, a parent to child, there is so much nuance in it. And again, I go back to this idea of a meta skill. It's not about being a licensed psychologist. It is about understanding that the dynamics that are at play require variance. And the variance that is required, a lot of times we're not equipped with that as teachers. And so this idea of you mentioned like the support, you mentioned the rules and the boundaries, all of those things, yes. But how you do those things is just as important, so that, yes, those consequences, they have to be there 1000%. But those consequences don't always have to be the type of consequences as we come to know them, where it is consequences of, I want to say this without causing confusion, but a lot of times a consequence can be your disappointment in them. That can be a consequence. But it doesn't sound as effective when I say it. But when you feel something like that, if there is somebody who I trust, if there is somebody who I have an admiration for, and I know that person is disappointed in me, that hits a lot differently than somebody who I do not have an authentic connection with. So there are certain foundational things that have to be there before other types of consequences. When you don't have, if I'm in a learning environment and I don't have the specific type of connection that warrants me to be able to demand certain things from someone, then the only thing that I can rely on are these sort of carrot and stick types of consequences. Is there a time and place for those things? Absolutely. But when that is the only source that you have to come from because that's all you've been taught, then you're limited with what you can do and you're going to be limited with your impact. But when we know how the building blocks of how to like authentically build the appropriate types of, and I'm using these generic terms because there's so much to it, but it's familiar. It's not just about building relationships, it's about building the right relationships the right way. And there again is nuance with it. And I don't mean to use these words about, the safety, because I know what it is that you're saying, but I don't agree with how that conversation was facilitated, because what what they were asking of you in that moment was not what they thought it was. Because in your mind, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, just please let me know. It's not a problem. In your mind, you're doing everything that you were supposed to do. And there, whoever those, specific leader, whoever that leader or those leaders were at that particular time, my thought process is that they're asking you questions that are coming from the policies and are coming from the training that they received, but not understanding what is below that from a human nature and a psychological standpoint of really what the mechanisms that are at play there. When you talk about psychological safety, when you talk about physical safety, when you talk about like just these cognitive processes that are a part of everyday living and interactions with human beings, it's not a surface level response. It's not a surface level question that you can ask. But when you ask it in a surface level way, and then when you ask a surface level question to a problem that is not surface level, that's when you get the problems of it feeling like gaslighting, because you know that you've put so much into it, the best that you may know how. There's anyone else, because I'm using the tools that I was given. But then you have a leader who is coming at you again, probably with the best that they know how too. And they're asking you something that you were not trained to do. And it comes across as if you're incompetent. It comes across as if you are purposely trying, or it comes across in a number of other ways that was not intended. You're doing the best that you can with the tools that you know how. Teachers are doing the best they can with the tools that they know how. The students, they're responding to the environment, good, bad, or indifferent. But those students, when given the right conditions, and this does not excuse the behavior, because they do, I'll use your word, they do act like brats. They 1000% do. And there is a lot less of, they're coming into this, going back to the earlier part of what I mentioned before. You talk about the implications of technology and the permissive parenting that is thought of as gentle parenting, but is really not. You have all of these systemic and systematic things that create the perfect storm for this explosion of student behavior issues that we are seeing now, combined with teachers who have not been prepared with understanding those rules of human nature and what causes someone to engage. And I say this like from a place of love, because when we go into these classrooms and we're not prepared and we're not equipped, you go into other places, and yes, you have students that are being taught at home. When you go into that classroom, that teacher, like those messages are coming at home from other cultures and other places, and it is clear as day. I would just say that you have a lot of teachers with the best of intentions doing the best that they can with the tools that they have. They're still unprepared, and it's not their fault. It's not our fault. It is not the teacher's fault that are in that classroom that are trying to manage the students that they have with the tools that they have and not getting good results. There is a way, but it has to start with us re-examining how we prepare to be teachers, because how those kids come into the classroom, we can't do anything about that. Unfortunately, like we can influence, once they get into that classroom, we can influence them a lot more than we think, but we have to have the proper tools. And that starts with understanding what is driving those students behaviorally and what it is that they're looking for consciously or subconsciously, whether we realize it or not, whether they realize it or not. And that is, I go back to this example, when you have that student that can behave one way in one classroom and go right next door, they are capable. They are very much capable. But if we do not equip our teachers with the tools that they need to elicit those qualities and the skills that we want to see from the students, we're going to keep getting the same problems that we're seeing day in and day out.
Very interesting. Two big topics came to mind as I was listening to you. And the first one is, I think there might be a fundamental disagreement on the root of misbehavior.
Mm-hmm.
I think one camp, at least from the teacher world that I've heard, is the root of misbehavior is a lack of understanding expectations or a lack of safety. And then there's another school of thought that says the root of misbehavior is just like kids are just naughty by nature. You don't have to teach them to lie, to steal. You got to
Hmm.
teach them to share and be nice. Kids,
Hmm.
unfortunately, can naturally be really bullies, can be
Hmm.
really cruel. That just comes prepackaged, and kids have to be explicitly taught, like, no, you don't hit your brother, you don't call names, you don't, lie and steal and cheat and do all these things. And so I think that that is where the rub is happening, because if you have the framework that almost expect kids will misbehave, they need to be taught by adults not to, and part of
Hmm.
that teaching is by rewards and consequences and relationship all together, then it makes more sense. But if you don't have the framework of kids are kind of naughty by nature and they will do whatever they're allowed to do, then all you're left with is, well, you must not have explained the directions to them and they must
Yes.
not feel safe. And so that's
Yes.
where I see that, that rub in education. And it would just drive me nuts in professional development meetings where they'd have these charts, reasons kids misbehave, and just saying, like, it's as if they believe that kids are perfect angels and they're so sweet and they would never do anything unless you didn't make them feel safe or unless they
Yes.
didn't understand the directions. And I just think that that is not true. And then the other topic that came to mind is just who are the ones that are unprepared. And I would argue it's not the teachers that are unprepared, it's actually the students that are coming
Mm.
in unprepared. Because I'm going back to that old school framework where kids were taught by parents, the school, the community. It
Yes.
wasn't any of this, oh, you got to like the teacher, blah, blah. It's like, no, like, you have a spelling test. Are you at home studying? You
Hmm.
have, these math assignments. Are you learning it? Like, it was like the kids shared responsibility. And in the modern education speak, it's practically 100-0. It's like if the kid
Oh
can
yeah.
do zero, and it's always going to go back to, well, what was wrong with your instruction? What was wrong with your delivery? What was wrong with your, relational dynamics? And it's like, I feel like going back to a more old school model, it's more like 50-50. It's like, yes, absolutely. The teacher needs to show up. They need to be professional. They need to be kind. They need to be warm. They need to have consequences. They need to have good instructional strategies. But literally none of that matters if kids come in not expecting or even feeling like they need to do the work. And that is the epidemic right now. Kids
Yes.
learn through all these crazy initiatives, whether it's like, equity grading, standards based grading, no zeros, 50 is the lowest score. They're learning
Those
that
things
you
drive
do
me
not
crazy.
have to, yeah, you don't have to do anything and you're going to
Yeah.
pass. So for
Yeah.
me, it goes back to that human nature piece. It's like, even as a grown person, it would be tempting, if in my university classes, if it was like it is today in school, it's like, I would know I need to produce nothing to get a degree. And it's like, that's just not how it is in the real world. And so
Hmm.
I think here's my proposition
Okay.
for the world. I think we need to go back to putting the pressure on the kids and the families, because they're the ones that are going to get that SAT test, or they're going to be the ones that have to study for the bar exam. They're going to be the ones that are out in the workforce. And they have got to learn how to learn, even if they don't like the teacher. They have to
Yeah.
learn to be self advocates. We are in a generation where we have ChatGPT, we have Google, we have Khan Academy, we have limitless free resources where a kid could be 3-4 years behind and just utilize these resources on their own time and grow by leaps and bounds. I've seen it, but getting kids to do that and getting families to buy in and take ownership has been one of the hardest things I ever faced in education, because there's almost an onslaught of educational resources. It's like we've got libraries and we're giving kids books and we're giving them free this and free that.
Hmm.
They've got a mountain of resources that kids in Africa don't have, that,
Hmm.
kids maybe on reservations don't have. And because all of the focus has been on, like, what's the teacher doing, we are disenfranchising kids where they are not learning the importance of education, and they are not learning that it is on them to learn, and they have no excuses in this day and age. People with less have done more and are doing more around the world with 100 times less than what a lot of American kids have access to. So I would reframe the entire conversation around, how can we get kids and parents to have buy-in again, for them to take ownership of their education? Because we can all again talk about classes where the teacher was terrible. We had to take that textbook and we had to learn. And
Yeah.
I think if there was a no excuses attitude in schools, where it's like, hey, this is on you. You don't want a zero under your name. Do you take pride in your education? That conversation's missing. from what I've seen in education, and all the heat and the focus and the trauma and the torment is on the
Hmm.
teachers, and they're just sweating and suffering. And that's why we've had hundreds of thousands of teachers quit in the last few years. I've interviewed and talked to thousands of teachers that have retired early, left
Yeah.
early, because teachers are getting treated like garbage, and all the focus and all of the onus is being put on teachers, and there's no responsibility with kids and parents. So that's my sermon. That's my sermon.
No, and you know what? You're absolutely right. I don't disagree. Me looking at that from the other side is understanding more of a trying to look at it from a locus of control, because what you're saying is 1,000% correct. But then that leads me to the next question of how. I know that I can, when I'm in the classroom, I know that if there's something that I'm missing, like teachers are exhausted right now. It's not but because they're doing the wrong things, but they're doing everything. We're trying to do this, that, and the third, and it is exhausting because you're not seeing the results. If I know that there are strategies, if I know that there are concepts that could get me, and think about it from an 80-20 perspective, right? You're talking about 20% of the strategies and the techniques that'll get you 80% of the results. If I know that there is a method, if there is a solution that I can learn that is going to influence my students, I have direct control over that. One thing that I do not have any control over is what people do with their kids at home. I can preach it until I'm blue in the face, and you would be right to do so. And you can have a movement, and you can start and go out in the community. You could put flyers on people's front doors. But at the end of the day, what they do with their kids is going to take place behind those closed doors. But what I do with my kids in my classroom, although it is directly impacted by what happens at home, 1,000%, I statistically have more influence on what happens in my learning environment. And if I know that I can shift that because I have 1,000% control over what it is that I do, and changing my thought process, not tearing down, and not, it's not about blame, because I don't want this to come across as blame. It's about understanding, okay, all right, hold on, this is not working. I need to make some adjustments here. What are those adjustments? Well, let's see. And you know what? You brought up a really good point. I'm going back to one thing that you mentioned, because I really liked this. You said that the kids, they inherently lie, they inherently push and bully. But that goes back to exactly what it was that I was saying before. Like, you don't have to teach a child to do that. You don't have to teach it. The behavior that you're seeing is lying, but what they're doing is actually protecting themselves, because they're protecting their reputation, whether they realize it and can articulate it or not. They're trying to keep themselves from getting in more trouble, not understanding that you've already caught them in the lie, but they don't get that at that moment. But there is an intent behind that. When a kid bullies another kid, and I'm not bullying, that's not the right word. When you see a child that may like not share, or when you see a child that may like push another kid out of the way, that is a maladaptive approach to a certain level of autonomy and a certain level of boundaries. They may not be doing it the right way, but the intention is still pure. I say all of that to say that's where we can come in and help to shape those behaviors to get them the same. Like, there's an end game in what it is that they're trying to do. And that's where we come in as parents and teachers to shape those behaviors, because we are the trusted guide and the trusted resource. And that facilitates and enhances like those learning and those social processing mechanisms. Like, all of those things are enhanced, and you don't have to teach anybody to seek that. When you understand what it is that they're trying to get, you can help them get to that same end with different behaviors. And if they can learn how to get to that same end from something that you did, that's twofold of a win, because they're getting what they want and they have a connection with you that is being built on top of that. Like, it's not about blame for teachers. It's about understanding that when we go through these teacher prep programs, because these teacher prep programs are coming from wonderful universities with wonderful goals, but they're created by people who do not sit in classrooms. They're created by people who do not understand human nature. They're created by state and federal systems that don't understand the children that are in the classroom. And so that systemically from the top down puts teachers in the classroom right out the gate behind the 8 ball. What I'm trying to do is help us understand that although we may not be prepared the way we need to be, and it's not our fault, it's not about blame, it is about, okay, what is it that I can do different? How do I need to approach this differently with what it is that I can control? I'm with you on that. I need these parents to act right. We need y'all to act right. But I also need to understand that I can't dictate what someone does in their own home, but I can dictate what happens in this classroom.
Definitely. And I would just kind of add to that. I think by going back to old fashioned consequences, parents would be motivated, maybe not so much in the reward way, maybe in the stick way a little bit, but they would be motivated to deal with their kids. It's like if your kid is suspended or expelled and you've got to find an alternative situation you're going to deal with your kid. If your kid is 100% going to fail because they're not turning in anything, they're not even trying, then the parent is going to want to deal with that situation. If, diplomas are not just being handed out for people that are reading on a second grade level, the parents are going to want to deal with that situation. And so I just think that inadvertently, by removing consequences, we've not only taken away a lot of the motivation for students, but we've done the same thing for parents because it's not their problem. It's like, and sometimes the way teachers have to kind of pad everything and, make everything look like sunshines and rainbows, sometimes the parents don't even have a full picture because we're not allowed to tell the truth about what's really going on. So I think I would agree that a lot of these issues are systemic, but in a different way. I think that the consequences, rewards, and standards was a huge protective factor that people didn't realize what would happen when we took that away. Because just a little bit about, my background, I have an ACE score of at least an 8 out of 10, with 10 being the most possible trauma, pretty much. And so I feel so passionately about education because I believe that it saved my life along with my faith. I was able to really, really get a love for reading. I was able to learn how to speak and communicate. I was able to get some structure, and just socialization and a lot of things that may have been missing. I was able to get some of those things in school. I went to an amazing high school that was kind of like a magnet school, for gifted, and that 100% over prepared me for college. And so I know what it's like to have an excellent, rigorous, at least high school education. The rest of the education was like normal, nothing fancy. But I so believe that the key for, achievement with Black and Brown students is not what we're doing today with taking away consequences and soft pedaling and babying them and saying you can cuss out the teacher and it's okay. Not saying that you're saying that, but I've literally heard that kind of thing in professional development meetings. I think that is entrenching a permanent underclass with Black and Brown people when they're not taught self-regulation, when they're not taught to respect authority, even if it's unjust and even corrupt. It's like a lot of people would still be alive today, sadly, if they had have learned how to deal with authority. It's a horrible thing, but it's reality. And so I think that we've actually set ourselves way back with a lot of the movements in education that is saying that they're trying to stop the school to prison pipeline. They're saying they're trying to have equity and social justice, but inadvertently, and we'll go with the idea that it's unintentional, they are making kids have worse outcomes than they ever had in history. And so I just think we have to sit back and really ask ourselves, are we putting the focus in the right place? Are there things teachers can do? Absolutely. But I just think it's acting as if we're in a vacuum, for a lot of the professional development movements to not acknowledge that teachers are actually being abused now. Teachers are actually being victimized now, not just by students, but by parents, by administrators, by the educational system and climate. It's just being a teacher, I feel like, is one of the worst jobs somebody could have, probably after being a police officer in this day and age. Two jobs where you're just unappreciated, abused, and people have the idea that they can do whatever they want to you and nothing's going to happen. And so I guess I would just make a plea for anybody that has influence in the world to really start telling the truth about what teachers are going through and to re-examine the idea that removing so-called punitive consequences is the right way to go. That's my plea always for whenever I talk about these issues.
Indeed. Consequences are important. Consequences without connection are going to get you, not, and when I say you, I'm talking about us. Consequences without any sort of connection is where the problem lies. Is where our problems can escalate and stem from, because it feels, when you issue someone a consequence that comes from a source that you don't really care about or that you don't see the value in, yes, you want to change the behavior, but the intention is as soon as that consequence is removed or as soon as the opportunity presents itself, you're not going to change the behavior. What you mentioned about that high school experience that you have, I don't want to gloss over that because there were so many things even now well into adulthood that you still go back to that experience over a decade or so ago, correct? About how you felt, about what that experience taught you, about yourself, about how you learned to interact. Like that was an important experience for you that had a lasting impact on you. And the reason that it had that impact is because from a fundamental standpoint, you were able to thrive in ways that you had not been able to, it seems to me, just going off of what you said prior to that. And it helped you to be able to step into a sense of purpose and identity. It helped you to be able to step into a place of understanding your value, whether it is amongst your peers and or greater society, and giving you a drive and a reason, all shaped by you being able to feel safe, all shaped by you being able to engage with your peers in a pro-social manner, all shaped by you being able to learn and develop and see how that learning and developed impacts things in and around and of you. When education is delivered in that manner, it can practically be unstoppable. I wholeheartedly believe that, one thing that I will push back on what you said is that, and I think this may have come from something that I said, but I don't want to cross those two things, because I do think that when teachers go into the learning environment, we do have the best of intentions. I do not believe that a lot of the policies and a lot of the structures that are put in place systemically have our best intentions in mind. I do not agree with that, and I do not think that that is the case, because there is too much evidence and too much research to show systemically how things have been put in place to hold back the brightness and the excellence that is of these Black and brown babies. Systematically, it is structured oppression and suppression. And when you have a system, because education, yes, we operate in the classroom, but we are a part of a greater system. One thing that we have to understand is that we are talking about a group or groups of people who historically have not had the best experiences with systems. You're talking about the education system, the judicial system, the housing system, the healthcare system. We do not historically have good experiences with these things. And there have been, again, and I'm saying this with intention, evidence and research and just a number of different ways to show that it has been unjust and inequitable. And so when you combine all of the systemic factors and doing some of these things that may have within those systems that are kind of designed not to work in everyone's favor, but then within those systems where you have policies that are trying to help, the system is going to win every time. Like that's one of the things that we're missing here with this. The greater system that is working against, but then you have subsystems and policies, or maybe even some of these rules that are trying to, let's try this and see what happens, but the broader system every time, because it has too much power. But one thing that they do not have enough power over is what happens in that classroom. The human to human connection and the power that you have can systematically and statistically outweigh a lot of stuff that is happening outside of that, in those hallways, in the community, and in those greater systems, because that power that you're going to have with that student, with those students, you can't, what can you make anybody? You can't make anybody do anything. I cannot, if I have these group of students right here and I say, I do this, what can you make anybody do? Nothing. But what can you influence them to do? When you understand what it is that drives them, you can influence them to do practically anything. And that is why, like, statistically, you'll have these pockets of classrooms and schools where you see these outliers. Those outliers aren't random. There's a reason for that. There's a reason that those students perform well. I was fortunate. I go back to the beginning when I talk about my experience in education. Once I learned, kind of when I had that bad experience of that parent calling me and telling me that her daughter was scared in my classroom, I was not that person. I was the person who used authority. And when I say authority, I'm talking about different types of authority here. But I was using like that iron fist authority where my way or the highway, I'm not the one, sit down and shut up. Like that's what I was doing in my classroom. But I didn't have any balance. I didn't treat it as a meta skill. But when I turned that around, Now we're talking about students in the same population where we got state level recognition. State, like I was teaching in the state of Virginia, we got recognized by the state because we did so well. And because of simple adjustments that I made, because I had a lot more control over what I was being told and what I subsequently realized. I had the influence to get those babies and unlock the potential that I saw in each and every one of them. I just didn't know how.
Well, thank you for sharing that. You have been such a sport to put up with me in this interview. I know I'm kind of like feisty and wild on this issue, but I
No,
do
it's
hope.
just, it is. And I
Oh,
appreciate it.
okay, good. Yeah, because I do feel so passionate about
Yeah.
education. I do love it so much because of my own personal experience. And the one thing that I would say in terms of the idea of systems, I actually don't 100% believe that narrative, because I do believe that individually, when a student takes the resources that they have on an individual level and do like I did, because it was the 90s and early 2000s, so there wasn't the same degree of distractions, but I would read for hours and hours and hours at a time. And even when I was like 12 years old, I was reading, theological books from the 1800s. Like, I really, really latched on to reading. And a lot of minorities from poor countries come over here and succeed in spite of whatever systems might be against them, because they really emphasize that hard work, really spending hours at home studying and learning and mastering skills instead of being on Fortnite for 4 hours. And that would be my dream if I could somehow, get people to believe that message. The amount of resources that kids have today, they need that guidance and they need to believe it, though. And they're not utilizing it for whatever reason. So any educators out there or just parents, if you can really talk to your kids, and to the degree that you have control, have your kids read with them, take the school books home, whether they're textbooks on an iPad, look at their homework, quiz them, make flashcards. If parents and kids would, I don't want to be rude when I call it a victim mindset, but if they would resist that and take on a resilience mindset and say, in 2025, I have the resources I need to be able to learn, to be able to grow. If they have the grades and the scores, they can get scholarships, they can go to school debt free. That's really my passion. But I would 100% agree that teachers do have a role in that. And I 100% agree that there is a place for relationship building. There is a place for teachers knowing how to de-escalate. There is a place for cultural competence and having trauma-informed awareness. I don't want anybody to walk away saying that I don't believe there's a place for that. My concern and fear is just that by taking out foundations of, structures with consequences and things like
And
that,
accountability.
all of those things kind of fall short. That's just my only
Sure.
concern with everything.
Sure. I get it. And it makes total sense. I really, really do. And I would add to your comment is that if parents, the data shows that parents are reading less to their kids now. So if you could read to your kids more, whether you're parent, educator, or anything in between, auntie, uncle, we're a community. And if you could read to the kids more, and also I would add, let kids get comfortable being uncomfortable with not being engaged and stimulated all the time. Let them sit in that boredom, and I'm using this, and experience what that is like, so that when they are inevitably in those circumstances, whether it is school, work, or anything in between, and they experience not being stimulated, they know how to deal with it. And it is not something that is unfamiliar, and you can't not predict, but you increase the chances of, some sort of maladaptive behavior. Let them sit in it. Take that tablet away. I had to do the same thing with my kids. I'm saying this like not as a you do this. I'm talking about from experience and what the research says. Like, nah, let me get that tablet. Go ahead. You're okay. I'm bored. I'm sure you can figure out something to do. You're smart. You got it. And let them get used to doing that, and arm them with the resilience. You used that word, arm them with that resilience, so that when they get into that classroom, when they get on that bus, when they get into that corporate world, when they get into whatever the situation may be, that's a tool from which they can use. A tool out of the toolbox from which they can use.
Awesome. 100% agreed. Well, this has been an awesome chat, Dr. Woodley. I was not expecting us to talk for nearly 2 hours, but thank you
Neither
so
was
much
I.
for being
It's
here.
all good.
Maybe you can come back one day and chat with us some more. But
I'd love to.
audience, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And Dr. Woodley, can you tell us where can we find you on the internet?
Sure. You can find me at all things Teach, Hustle, Inspire, TEACHHUSTLEINSPIRE, Teach, Hustle, Inspire. And again, my name is Dr. Sean Woodley, and I appreciate you. Thank you, Trish.